kept hearing, anybody play Dungeons and Dragons? I kept hearing that. Dungeons and Dragons. Does that make sense to anybody? No? Alright, you better get it now. It makes sense to you? What does it make sense to you? Come a little closer. No, back here. Come here. I heard it, man. It sounds crazy, I know. You can do it. Come on. You can do it. Come on. Why does that make sense to you?
It was a ritual I had to go through.
A ritual you had to go through?
I went through satanic ritual abuses. I was used.
SRA?
Yes, sir.
And it was something with Dungeons and Dragons?
They named them different things.
They named them different things. I kept hearing Dungeons and Dragons. So come here. Come here, girl. You're stronger than the spirits in you. Come here. Come here. Come. Put your feet here. You can do it. He loves you. Come here. Come here. Come here. Give me your hand. Okay. Now say this, okay? Say I renounce. You can do it. I renounce. I renounce.
I don't know what's gonna happen to me.
You're gonna get free. I renounce. And you're gonna get let go from all these demons. Yeah.
I renounce
All the rituals. All the rituals.
Can I do that?
Yes, you can. All the you're a Christian, right?
Yeah. They just say things. If you do things, they say that things are gonna happen. You know.
That's a lie. That's a lying spirit. All the rituals.
All the rituals
From SRA.
from SRA.
Anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons. Come on. Anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons.
Anything to do.
That's right. Anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons.
Anything to do with Dungeons and Dragons.
I renounce it.
I renounce
And
it.
its hold on me. And its hold on me.
And it's hold on me.
In Jesus' name.
In Jesus' name.
All right. Every spirit associated with Dungeons and Dragons, leave her life now. Come on out of her. Yep. Out of the body. Every little satanic spirit. Can't have her. In Jesus' name. All right, give me. She's open. She's ready. Any of my forerunners or any team, just check her and see anything else.
I do not think that many parents are aware of what's inside the game. In fact, in my presentation, I show many pictures from the inside of the books just to show the images of this game. I mean, the gruesomeness of this game and the occult link to it.
Well, I know that when I did my message, and this has happened, I have letter after letter where people took the pieces. Now, there's sixes involved in the pieces of the game, but they'd take the pieces of the game, they would throw them in the incinerator or the fireplace, and screams would come out because there seemed to be some kind of spiritual forces inhabiting those pieces, and children would drop out of life. They didn't want to study anymore. What are the pieces, for instance?
Well, this game affects the most intelligent of our children. And the pieces include white witches, wizards, necromancers, the clerics, that type of thing. It includes evil wizards. It's a white versus black witchcraft. The good versus evil is white versus black witchcraft. And Anton LaVey, the writer of the Satanist Bible, says there is no such thing as white witchcraft.
Well, being a Satan worshiper, he should know.
Yeah, he should.
know about Dungeons and Dragons?
I don't really know anything about Dungeons and Dragons. Like, are you talking about like a specific book, or like you're just talking about like Dungeons and Dragons?
The game that people
game.
play.
Oh.
Did you know that it's a game?
I didn't know it's a game.
No, I know that it's a really fantastic tabletop RPG game.
Around the 70s and 80s when I was younger, it was really popular.
Personally, I'm not interested in virtual reality. I'm interested in the real world.
Becoming someone else in the best possible way.
I didn't really have any involvement in it because it was kind of taboo at that point. Like, a lot of people said it was evil.
Oh, really?
And it was demonic and blah, blah, blah. So it had this notion with it that, you know, people shouldn't play it, blah, blah, blah.
Dungeons and Dragons. It's a devil's game.
It does trouble me a little bit to think that lots of young people might spend a lot of their time in a fantasy world.
My oldest son plays it.
I think anyone could play D&D, honestly. I mean, anyone who likes imagining things, basically.
All sorts of people are drawn to D&D and other role-playing games. I find that people who love the game most are people who have very active imaginations and like to find a way to engage that imagination while still hanging out with friends.
It's a trap.
I launch magic missile! Yeah! Woo!
Because there was two.
The merging would have been a good idea.
Sure.
We need a bed!
Laying down.
Laying down! And role-playing provides a unique avenue to do that. My favorite aspect of role-playing games is actually the social and shared storytelling aspect. I'm able to interact with my friends and create a shared universe in which we can affect and change the outcome of events as the storyteller presents them to us.
So, when do we worship Satan?
We don't. Dungeons and Dragons isn't Satan's game.
It's similar to what a high-stakes poker game might be like. It's a game where friends gather that's taken deadly seriously and is a lot of fun, but it's serious. Like, it's very serious. Like, we're on an adventure that we are, like, I think about a lot during the week. I'm looking up stuff and
our text thread is crazy.
Yeah.
And this game in a town that can be a little bit fake at times. Let's just be fair. This game has cut through so much of that social noise.
Oh, no. Okay, you have a strong chance of not messing up.
Do a 20.
Oh! 11. Boom! That's huge!
I've been running this particular campaign for almost 2 years. There was a core group. My brother, John Castle, he and I actually co-wrote a Dragonlance script when Dungeons and Dragons was at Warner Brothers. Kyle Newman, he directed Fanboys, co-authored Art and Arcana, which is the visual history of all the artwork of D&D, and then he just wrote a D&D cookbook. Ryan Vernier. Ryan is a story designer for League of Legends. Ron Matthews, he's a CrossFit Masters champion. At 46 years old, he was the fittest man on earth over 45. I had previously recruited the Big Show from WWE Wrestling. He and I became friends, and he was shooting a TV show in LA. He said, "Hey, bro, I'm going to be there for a few months. Save me a seat, bro. Bring in my dice. We got to play." The group then was joined by Tom Morello on the Mount Rushmore of guitar players of all time. And then one day he said, "Hey, there's this guy in my kid's carpool that wants to play." I said, "Oh man, I don't know. The group's getting kind of big. You know, we were around like 6 or 7. He said, "The group's kind of getting big. I don't know." I said, "Well, who's your friend?" He said, "Oh, his name's Dan. He co-created Game of Thrones." I was like, Dan Weiss? All right, yeah, he can play. That's cool. Vince Vaughn was a buddy of Tom's from Chicago.
I got introduced by Mr. Morello. He was kind of giving me books and talking to me and kind of like, you should pick this out. We went on a trip and he kind of brought stuff with him, and so he got me.
While there is some disagreement on how much chainmail played a part in the development of Blackmore, both games form the foundation of D&D. Blackmore deviates somewhat from the normal high fantasy of D&D, as it involved a number of science fiction elements and pieces of technology, concepts mostly left behind nowadays in D&D. In 1972, Arneson visited Lake Geneva and ran a game of Blackmore for a group that included Gygax, who fell in love with the concept and saw its potential. Arneson mailed 18 handwritten pages of info about Blackmore to Gygax, who expanded on them until he had a 50-page document for a new game. He began testing the game with his children, naming the campaign Castle Greyhawk. Others soon joined the game, and Gygax sent out the rule set to other wargamers to try it out. Arneson and Gygax continued to correspond to share details about their campaigns and flesh out the rules, with Gygax wanting to get the game published as soon as possible, since there were now similar games in the works. Gygax's revision of the rules numbered 150 pages, and Guidon Games rejected to publish it since it was too large for them. So Gygax then went to the largest wargaming company, Avalon Hill. The idea of role-playing was a little too fresh for Avalon Hill, who also passed on it. Arneson couldn't afford to help fund any part of the venture, so ultimately he was left behind as Gygax looked to self-publish. Gygax, along with two gaming acquaintances, formed a new company called Tactical Studies Rules, which would later become known as TSR Inc. Between the three of them, they were able to finally publish Dungeons and Dragons, released in January of 1974, as a box set containing 3 books, one for Men and Magic, one for Monsters and Treasure, and one for the Underworld and Wilderness Adventures. 1,000 copies were put together in Gygax's home, and the run sold out in 11 months, selling for $10 each, about $50 in today's money. The first set of Dungeons & Dragons is based on chainmail, and assumes the reader has played it before, using its measurement and combat systems. An optional combat system included would later become the primary combat system, however. The original D&D included concepts such as ability scores, character classes such as Fighting Man, Magic User, and Cleric, races such as Human, Dwarf, and Elf, and of course, both Dungeons and Dragons, along with a host of other monsters. A groundbreaking game, things were looking pretty good for TSR, but in January of 1975, one of the founders, Don Kay, suffered a heart attack and passed away. His 1/3 share of the company wasn't specifically mentioned in his will, so it was left to his wife, who had no interest in gaming and wanted nothing to do with the company. By this point, the company was being run out of Gygax's basement, and they reorganized it into a corporation. The other 2 founders needed to buy out the shares owned by Kay's wife, but lacked the funds to do so, so they turned to Brian Bloom's father. With Bloom's father owning 200 shares now, and Bloom himself owning 240, Gygax and his 150 shares became a minority shareholder of the company he had recently founded. The gaming development continued, however, with Gygax writing a number of supplements for D&D, a Wild West-themed RPG called Boot Hill, and the creation of a fantasy gaming periodical called The Dragon. Dave Arneson would actually be hired by TSR as part of the creative staff, but would only stay with the company for 10 months. Dungeons & Dragons was a success, but it was still far too esoteric for a widespread audience to embrace, due to its strong roots in the wargaming scene. The Greyhawk supplement, written in 1975, based around Gygax's homebrew campaign, was a very important step in the right direction, adding a new combat system, the Thief and Paladin classes, rules for weapons with varying damages, new spells, treasure, and many more now iconic monsters. In 1977, an outside writer named J. Eric Holmes came to TSR with the offer of writing an introductory book for Dungeons & Dragons to encourage more people to try out the game. TSR hired him, and he incorporated elements from the original D&D game, as well as the Greyhawk supplement and other supplements, producing the Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set. The idea of a basic set with rules for the first few levels and everything you and a group need to get started would carry on to this day. That same year, however, TSR released a brand new edition of D&D, not specifically compatible with the basic set they just released, called Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. AD&D would be the start of a series of Dungeons & Dragons editions leading up to the modern 5th edition, and would depart from the basic set due to its extensive set of rules. The basic set would be expanded upon and revised over the years as a simpler version of D&D, accompanied by its own continuation called the Expert Set. This line of editions was eventually cut off in 1995, but many people still enjoy these versions, now commonly referred to as D&D BX, and there is a whole movement of RPGs called the Old School Renaissance, or OSR, that draws inspiration from these games. Mostly though, if you're talking about D&D, you're talking about Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. AD&D was distinct enough from previous versions of D&D that Gygax refused to pay Dave Arneson any royalties on the products, claiming that it was a new product entirely. Arneson sued the company, leading to a settlement which gave him a 2.5% royalty on all AD&D products. A pretty nice payout, as it turns out. Rather than the looser, lighter tone of the basic set written by Holmes, which encouraged improvisation, AD&D was written with a very tight structure in mind, with rules for many different situations and scenarios, so that the rulebooks could be used during tournament play. AD&D was a harsher game than later editions, but it captured all of the magic of role-playing, and would be the framework that Dungeons & Dragons would continue to build off of. All of the rules were spread across 3 books, now a familiar concept: the Monster Manual, the Player's Handbook, and the Dungeon Master's Guide. AD&D would be the principal D&D edition for a decade, with many, many supplements and adventures being written for it. Most of what we associate with D&D would come out of this period, either from Gygax or from other writers working for TSR. By 1980, TSR was pulling in $8.5 million a year through D&D sales, and by 1982, that number had jumped up to $16 million. D&D had become a nationwide phenomenon, not necessarily through player numbers, but definitely in public awareness. Much of Dungeons & Dragons' attention throughout the 80s was negative, however, due to circumstances around a couple of deaths and a satanic panic pointed at D&D.
It began as a cult phenomenon, then it caught on. Now a new game is sweeping the country.
You will burn forever and ever in eternal torment. You are no more.
The role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons debuted in 1974. It became a hit with many adolescents, but critics claimed it was an invitation to devil worship.
The witchcraft, the demonism, the spells.
And worse.
It is not fun and games.
The media set off a satanic panic.
A lot of adults who think it's been connected to a number of suicides and murders.
That connection has been largely debunked.
It's nothing but a witch hunt.
And the game has generated an unexpected legacy.
This was a revolution.
On a summer day in August 1979, the family of a missing teenager called a Texas investigator named William Deere with some startling information.
Dallas Egbert had disappeared from Michigan State University during the summer session.
James Dallas Egbert III was a 16-year-old sophomore, and his family hired Deere to help find him.
He was a computer nerd, and he had a large amount of hair and carried his little briefcase. I wasn't sure that I was being told exactly what precipitated his disappearance, so I said, well, I guess the best thing we can do is I'll go to Michigan State University and I'll find out for myself exactly what was going on.
What he found when he went to Egbert's dorm room was a shelf of neatly stacked books and something else.
There was a cork board with a series of tacks.
In what might look like a random pattern of thumbtacks, the investigator saw what he thought could be a clue. The shape resembled a building that was part of a network of underground campus steam tunnels, which students told him they sometimes explored.
We set out with maps, and we started going into the tunnels one morning with press everywhere. I entered with the idea that I did not know what I was getting into.
But he had a hunch that it had something to do with a game that was growing in popularity.
This is a quest in a fantasy world of castles and dungeons, monsters and dragons. This world has become real to these people. It's all part of a game called Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons, also known as D&D, was created by the late Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in the early 1970s. It was born out of their love for military war games, and they devised scenarios with made-up characters that incorporated their interest in history and fantasy fiction. Gygax said it provided an escape.
All of us at times feel a little inadequate in dealing with the modern world. It would feel much better if we knew that we were a superhero or a mighty wizard.
The game is played in a group, and the guide, or dungeon master,
you enter a very small room.
Talks the players through the fictional, sometimes violent adventures they will go on.
And each has an elaborate scoring sheet for his character, with points for wisdom and strength and the like. A throw of these special dice decide the outcome of battles in an intricate scoring system. Nothing is acted out. The real action is in the mind.
Okay, Pat Robertson. Pat Robertson was asked about video games and role-playing games and strategy games, and he says, this is just so crazy, that Dungeons and Dragons is demonic and has literally ruined people's lives. You can't make this stuff up. You just really can't. Here's Pat Robertson.
I want to ask for your opinion. Is it safe for a Christian to enjoy video games that have magic in them if the person playing the games is not practicing the magic?
Right.
I think, you know, the idea is not how close can I get to danger,
Really?
but how far away can I stay from it. I don't know what game you're talking about. I know there's one called Dungeons and Dragons that literally destroyed people's lives. I mean, they got into this thing and they were almost, it was like demonic. I don't know what game you're talking about, but if it's based on magic and the occult and that sort of thing, stay away from it. There are other...
He's heard about this thing, Dungeons and Dragons, which has destroyed people's lives. What, did their figurine get knocked off of the table? I mean, how can it destroy people's lives?
On the morning of July 5th, 1988, police responded to an anonymous call in Washington, North Carolina, and were dispatched to the Smallwood subdivision home of Leith Peter von Stein. They knocked on the ornate mahogany doors of von Stein's home, but no one answered. After a few minutes of no responses, they resorted to breaking down the door, fearing that something horrible had truly happened. There was seemingly no one on the lower level to notice the intrusion, so they made their way upstairs to find the mutilated bodies of the homeowner and his wife, Bonnie. Leith Peter von Stein was already dead, his body beaten beyond recognition by a blunt object and covered in numerous cuts from what police assumed was a small blade. His wife, however, would survive, despite her gruesome injuries. In a room nearby, they found the von Steins' 18-year-old daughter, Angela, who had seemingly slept through the entire encounter. She was brought in for questioning. As police searched the upper levels of the house, they discovered signs that pointed to robbery. A busted window, drawers opened in the bedroom, some jewelry missing. Police noted that it seemed odd for this level of brutality to be connected to a simple robbery. And furthermore, they noticed odd discrepancies. Some jewelry had been taken, but most of it was left behind, with seemingly little care given to the actual value of the items stolen. Police also eventually noticed glass outside, and realized that the window that had been busted was actually broken from the inside, and furthermore plainly wasn't locked in the first place. Signs seemingly pointed to the murderer staging the crime scene so that it would appear to be a robbery. The von Stein's daughter, Angela, seemed to be completely horrified and dumbfounded by the murder. Despite investigators interrogating her for hours, they never saw any indication from her that she had anything to do with the murder. While it was clearly suspicious that she had slept through such a brutal attack, it soon came to light that the girl had a history of drug addiction, which could definitely have played a part in her sleeping a little more deeply than the average person. Police were baffled. Clearly this was an inside job, but the only logical suspect appeared by all accounts to be wholly innocent. The von Steins had a son as well, Christopher, but at the time of the murder he was away at the student residencies of the North Carolina University, with multiple people able to back up his alibi for the night. Adamantly refused to take the test. Police began investigating him much more closely following this. Through conversations with fellow students, an unusual picture of Christopher was painted. He was described as a character, strange, weird, and off the wall. He was the kind who was always trying to prove something, one friend said. He was a dreamer too, filled with big plans for the future that regularly bubbled out of him, but some friends wondered how he would ever accomplish such grand schemes. He also seemed to have one hobby that regularly took up his time: Dungeons and Dragons. After he stumbled upon a flyer they posted in the dorm lobby, offering free beer to anyone who joined their campaign, he went straight to the 8th floor and introduced himself to the Dungeon Master, James Bartlett Upchurch III, who wanted friends to call him Moog. He quickly struck up a close friendship with Upchurch and the other player, Neil Henderson, and started playing weekly with the duo. Police started pressing Neil and Upchurch about the murder, and to their surprise, Neil broke down and confessed. He claimed that he had driven Upchurch to the Von Stein residence at the prompting of Christopher, so that Upchurch could murder Leith and Bonnie, and Christopher could inherit their wealth. Naturally, police were astonished that Christopher had been able to manipulate his two seemingly very normal friends into committing such violent acts. Apparently, Christopher was also quite the manipulator. By all accounts, he was charismatic and resourceful, able to pull people into the excitement of his great schemes, even though they rarely went anywhere. He also pushed the pair to explore the sewers below the university, and occasionally even game down there. It was on one such occasion, in the dark tunnels, that the idea of murdering his parents was first pitched by Christopher. He revealed to his friends that his parents had money. Then, he coerced them into talking about all of the incredible things they could buy if they had that much money. Cars, pools, drugs. And then he pitched his plan, which, if successful, would give him an alibi, the police would have no logical leads, and in a few months he could share the money with the two. At first, they did resist the idea, but Christopher was quite persuasive, promising more and more until they finally agreed. Using the same paper and format the group used to set up encounters for Dungeons and Dragons, Christopher mapped out the neighborhood and the house itself. For this murder, Christopher would be the Dungeon Master. Church. Slowly but surely, they ironed out the plan. The three would later admit that they got lost in the fantasy, and thinking in terms of the game they played made it seem less real to them. So I'll do my best to describe the murder the way they would have imagined it, even though it might seem a little morbid.
For a while, Dungeons and Dragons was said to be a game that corrupted the minds of the youth and led to demonic possession. Back in the early 80s, young adults and high schoolers would go to their local game store, buy a box set of this really cool new game, all based around storytelling and imagination. They would meet up, order pizza, sit together, and play an epic tale of adventure. A couple cases started to appear where some of these young people playing Dungeons and Dragons had disappeared or were found harmed. Parents of these kids had concluded that Dungeons and Dragons was the cause of their child's fate. But was the game really the cause? One parent in particular started a group called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, or BAD, after her son had tragically passed away from suicide. Much like the argument against video games, there was a strong link in mental illness, depression, and even some drug addiction in most of the cases presented as arguments against D&D. Then there were the religious groups that argued the topics of magic and witchcraft in the game would lead young minds to corruption and ultimately lead them to performing demonic rituals, resulting in possession. Another argument made was that the youth would have a hard time distinguishing between reality and fantasy, and may take this role-playing game too far. One of the most widely known depictions of D&D as an evil game comes from the movie Mazes and Monsters, where Tom Hanks plays a youth who is slowly corrupted by the game, ultimately leading to his psychotic break and being unable to differentiate reality from fiction. This movie is loosely based on one of the tragic disappearances mentioned earlier. There was even a claim that if your character died in D&D, then you as the player were more likely to commit suicide. These claims have been proven to be highly unlikely. Highly. In the decades since this moral panic struck amongst concerned parents and family, vast amounts of research has been done on the effects of games on the human brain. Though there are mentions of demons and devils in the game, and though there are the 9 rings of hell as a plane of existence in the world.
So in Baldur's Gate, The Descent into Avernus, you have contracts, these infernal contracts. What do players get out of them, and what do the devils get from them?
So the players can get anything from assistance, they can get items, they can get gold, they can get power. There's even possibility of gaining levels. So depending on what the player wants, the devils are more than willing to supply you with that.
Devils are the worst capitalist opportunists you'll ever meet.
But therein is the temptation, and therein is the problem, because the devils ultimately want your soul and they want your servitude. But they will pave that road with with gold and lovely things. They'll make it as easy for you to walk that slippery slope as possible. And so in the game, there's actually a chart that the DM can track these deals on, who the devil was, who made it with which character in the party. And they also can provide fine print, things that maybe the character doesn't know about. It's like if the character has failed on a roll, or if they don't, they're like, fine, whatever, I'll just sign it. If their back's up against the wall. Characters can also try to get out of death with a deal.
If a character has failed 2 death saves and is about to make their 3rd, an archdevil could basically kind of whisper telepathically in their ear and say, I'll keep you alive. This is what it's going to cost you. And you can make that deal right then and there, and you'll get a natural 20 on your 3rd death save.
I love this.
Someone's going to take it.
So everyone's going to take it.
When you're in the 9 hells, you're in the devil's domain, and they're running that show, and they have control. The archdevils control each of their layers. So when you're on that layer, metaphysically, you are in the palm of their hand. They have absolute control metaphysically over that. So when you are down there, your wildest dreams can come true, but also your darkest nightmares as well. So beware.
Hell is hell, and you want it to feel like hell, where nothing ever goes right and no one really gets what they want.
Right.
Not even the people who rule the place get what they want. That's just the nature of hell.
Right. They have no one they can trust anyways.
Right. There are some mechanisms built into that the DM can use as well to sort of accentuate that idea. Like, bad things can happen when you roll a 1.
You can deal up in levels, you can deal up in power, you can deal up in hit points. Like you can make a deal just about for anything. And the higher the deal is, the more costly it's going to be to you. So the thing of like you go into hell, only those who are really hold and stick to their values can come out of hell unscathed. And that was one of our themes that we had talked about in the story meetings, where it's like the righteous path is the most difficult path. Like if you really want to be righteous, it is gonna be hard. It is gonna be really difficult even just to get point A to point B, let alone complete the adventure and do what you need to do to save everything. So we were like, you're gonna come out scarred, you're gonna come out changed. Like, the idea when we talked about Tomb of Annihilation was like, one of the things was if you enter the tomb, you're gonna come out different. Like you're gonna have a chicken foot, or you're gonna have a scar, or you're gonna be missing your ear, or something weird's gonna happen.
Yeah, no one walks out of the tomb.
No.
Well, at least without a few things missing. and most people don't walk out of the tomb.
No, yeah, most people don't walk out.
So
However,
so this is more psychological stuff, or soul-wise.
Yeah.
Or compromising your character's morality.
Yeah, I see this as kind of like, the Senate. Like you're a congressman or you're a senator, and you're like, I'm going to change things. I'm going to really make a difference. And you go in there with these high ideals, and when you hit the game and you're dealing with these elder devils, they're trying to pull you out of your idealism and corrupt you, and just like, well, take a little money here, or do a little deal there, or do this little thing, or how about this? How about a nice free vacation? And how about a house in the tropics? Like, all that stuff is like, it's innocent. It doesn't feel wrong. But as it accumulates, then you realize, I bought into it. I lost myself. And So that's kind of the vibe, and that has nothing to do with your hit points and with your, with how powerful you are as a player, character. It has to deal with your role playing.
Yeah.
So
your choices.
This is a very heavy role play adventure. So when you go in, the DM we give the DM as many tools as we can about how to role play devils, and give them all these tools and like ways. Here's things devils can offer you, and here's ways that devils can pull. We even have a sheet where it's about devil dealings, and like you mark down the character who made the deal and what deal they made, and like and what the small print is, and who they made it with. And if you accumulate enough of these, like you may not get out. Like your soul may become so heavy that you've either got to be redeemed at the end of it, or all your good buddies leave and you kind of no, and like now I'm a part of this. That this place has kind of seeped into my being and has corrupted it. So we've tried to get that feeling of that hell is a place and that it has an agenda, and that agenda is to take you out of your heroicness and sort of make you become a part of it.
Now, earlier today, I said on Twitter that if you look at the mainstream media and you replace the word racism or white supremacy from the headline with devil worship and demon worship, you're going to get headlines very similar from the 80s. And of course, people said it's a boomer take. They said that I'm full of shit, which is why I decided to make this video. So as you can see, there's a lot of articles saying that Dungeons & Dragons is racist. So let's replace racism with demon worship, and here you have it. You have an article from the 1981 that talks about how Dungeons & Dragons is about demon worshipping. And we're going to look at several articles because there was an entire theme going around about it, saying that Dungeons & Dragons is not just a game, but it's a gateway to hell. And it's pretty much the same with the articles from 2021. Dungeons & Dragons isn't just a game, but it's a gateway to the far right, it's a gateway to sexism, it's a gateway to racism. The only difference, I would say, is that the criticism from the 80s was coming from the outside. So the people that were criticizing the game weren't the same people that were making the game. And as such, you didn't notice many changes. Now the criticism is coming from within. So this is why you get ridiculous changes like orcs cannot be an evil race, drow aren't all an evil race. Like many changes in order to make the game more progressive, to, I guess, end racism in society through Dungeons & Dragons. But imagine if the same logic would have been applied in the 80s and you'd have magic removed from the game. You would have devils as a race removed from the game. It would make the game less enjoyable. It would limit the fantasy and the opportunity. But let's look at what the people were complaining back then. So this article is from 1981. And it says that to other people, Dungeons & Dragons is not a harmless pastime. It's actually a front for demon worship and witchcraft, while proponents see it as a wholesome, constructive release. Regardless of which view one believes, the battle which rages over the moral implications of Dungeons & Dragons are as heated as the violent conflict which takes place in the game itself. So I want you to take a step back and realize that this is written in an actual newspaper for mainstream publication, and is suggesting that you can use Dungeons & Dragons in order to become a warlock. Okay? And this is not from 100 years ago. This is quite recent. There are people who are alive now who lived in the time when this is what the press was publishing. And this is how the press was attacking people. And there is an actual movie, by the way, which is suggesting that people who play Dungeons & Dragons become murderers.
The very first time we meet Mike, Will, Lucas and Dustin, they're rolling D20s in the basement of the Wheeler house. Fast forward a few years and there's an official Stranger Things D&D set, and people can talk about Demogorgons without fear of being spitballed. What you might not know, however, is that outrage surrounding D&D and Stranger Things 4 is not a dramatic invention. It seems unreal that a community could become suspicious of a game that encourages people to spend time together, use their imaginations, and even learn some arithmetic on the side.
They'd have to roll a 13 or higher. Too risky. Cast a protection spell. Don't be a pussy.
But sure enough, the show gets plenty right about the disproportionate reaction to the popularity of Dungeons and Dragons in the early 1980s. It began in 1979, 5 years after D&D was first published. 16-year-old James Dallas Egbert III disappeared from his room at Michigan State University. His family hired a private investigator, William Deere, to find him. The truth is that Egbert, suffering from depression and drug addiction, had gone into hiding in the utility tunnels under the university. But Deere believed that Egbert's interest in Dungeons and Dragons was the cause of the problem, especially since students allegedly played live-action D&D sessions beneath the school. The story captured public attention, and the nationwide focus on Egbert's disappearance actually led to soaring sales of Dungeons and Dragons. Suddenly, millions of people were playing instead of just thousands. Egbert was found 2 months after he disappeared, but committed suicide a year later. This, however, was just the beginning of public scrutiny of D&D. In 1982, a high school student in Virginia named Irving Lee Pulling II committed suicide by shooting himself in the chest. His mother, Patricia Pulling, believed her son's interest in D&D was to blame. Pulling first tried to sue her son's high school principal, claiming a curse placed on her son's character during a game run by the principal was actually real. She also brought an action against TSR, the game's publishers. After her lawsuits were dismissed, Pulling formed an action group called Bothered About Dungeons and Dragons, otherwise known by its somewhat unambiguous acronym, BAD. What began as simple condemnation quickly became a full-scale moral panic, similar to the outcry surrounding gory comic books in the 50s.
At first regarded as a harmless game of make-believe, now has both parents and psychologists concerned.
Pulling went so far as to describe D&D as a fantasy role-playing game which uses demonology, witchcraft, voodoo, murder, rape, blasphemy, suicide, assassination, insanity, sex perversion, homosexuality, prostitution, satanic-type rituals, gambling, barbarism, cannibalism, sadism, desecration, demon summoning, necromantics, divination, and other teachings.
So you fight with dice?
Yes, but these aren't your normal dice. They have up to 20 sides.
It sounds shocking now, but the campaign gained widespread, uncritical coverage via conservative Christian outlets and the mainstream media. BAD even published a series of warnings designed to help identify the first signs of teenage Satanism.
That's Tom Hanks flipping out in a cave from the 1982 made-for-TV movie Mazes and Monsters.
It's a glimpse into the moral panic surrounding the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game of the 1980s. So let's roll for initiative.
Mazes and Monsters is just one of a handful of films that sought to capitalize on the fears that the Dungeons and Dragons role-playing game was a gateway to madness, occult violence, and suicide.
Hanks' character winds up insane at the end, completely detached from reality, all thanks to his obsessive gaming.
Also consider the 1983 horror film Skullduggery, in which a group of adults, clearly engaged in the most joyless game night of all time, play a little Dungeons and Dragons and descend into a world of supernatural murder.
Of course, these films were just the tip of the exploitation iceberg here. The real heat came from the fundamentalist Christian groups and the advocacy group, BAD.
All the hoopla largely stemmed from two tragic incidents. The first being the 1979 disappearance of Michigan State University student James Dallas Egbert III. Suffering from depression and drug addiction, Egbert took to the university utility tunnels and there attempted suicide.
Oblivious to this, Egbert's family hired a private investigator to find their son, and the investigator erroneously initially singled out the Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game as a likely cause of the young man's disappearance.
The second episode of note was the 1982 suicide of high school student Irving Lee Pulling. Pulling's mother, Patricia, sued both the high school principal and the publishers of Dungeons & Dragons, claiming that Irving's death stemmed from a curse placed on her son in a D&D game run by the principal.
Both suits were dismissed, but Patricia Pulling continued her crusade against the demonic, soul-rotting power of the game through the formation of Bothered About Dungeons & Dragons, or BAD.
BAD's message found an audience through conservative Christian groups and ultimately through the mainstream media as well, which was revving up into a moral panic over the perceived but equally erroneous threat of satanic ritual abuse.
A moral panic is a viral, widespread unrest sparked by our collective fears about society's direction and fueled by a variety of cultural influences.
It never takes much for the flames of such fears to burn out of control, especially when the fires are stoked by trusted voices in the media or the words of experts.
One such expert was Thomas Radecki, who argued that just as role-playing serves as a powerful psychotherapy tool, role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons misuse that very power.
Like an abused medication, role-playing corrupted impressionable young minds with a world of fantasy, violence, sex, and sorcery. Or that was the accusation at any rate.
Between the two, demons came first, introduced in the Eldritch Wizardry supplement for original D&D in 1976. They are stated to be chaotic evil creatures, typically forced into servitude by stronger and smarter demons. They all possess the ability to teleport, create darkness, and open a gate to summon other demons. In this supplement, and in the AD&D First Edition Monster Manual, demons are not referred to by name, but instead by a ranking of Type 1 through Type 6, although the Type 6 is referred to as a Balor, essentially a copy of the Balrog from Tolkien's works. Eldritch Wizardry also details the Succubus as a unique demon, and two demon princes, Orcus and Demogorgon. For Demogorgon, the text states that it is contended by some that this demon lord is supreme, and in any event, he is awesome in his power. I'm sure the kids from Stranger Things would agree. More demons would be created over time, each with their own names and details, but for 2nd edition AD&D, due to the satanic panic heavily associated with the game, TSR renamed the species of demons to the Tanari. Little else was changed other than the name, so that TSR could state they no longer had demons in their game. But by 3rd edition in 2000, they were back to being called demons, with Tanari stated as their subtype. By 4th edition, the term Tanari was dropped entirely.
One day in the year of the fox came a time remembered well, when the strong young man of the rising sun heard the tolling of the great black bell. One day in the year of the fox, when the bell began to ring, meant the time had come for one to go to the temple of the king. There in the middle of the circle he stands, searching, seeking. With just one touch of his trembling hand, the answer will be found. Daylight waits while the old man sings, heaven, help me. And then like the rush of 1,000 wings, it shines upon the one, and the day had just begun. One day in the year of the fox came a time remembered well, when the strong young man of the rising sun heard the tolling of the great black bell. One day in the year of the fox, when the bell began to sing, that the time had come for the one to go to the temple of the king. There in the middle of the people he stands, seeing, feeling, with just a wave of a strong right hand he's gone to the temple of the king.
I'm Anto, and today we're making a deal with the devil. Stick around to the end of the video and I'll tell you how to get hold of this infernal contract for free. Devils in D&D and other RPGs are well known for their contract making, and this makes them excellent choices to deploy in your games to add some drama and make some new and interesting plot lines. Devils can offer you great wealth or assist you in a task, but their help comes with a price, and that price is defined in the contracts that we're going to be talking about today. Before we get into the details of the contract, I think it's worth just talking briefly about Devil Society and how devils act, just so we can understand them a little bit more. In traditional D&D lore, devils are lawful evil creatures that hail from the 9 hells. They are usually obsessed with furthering their own power or furthering the power of their masters, and there are 2 things that unify pretty much all devils. The first is organization and structure. They are lawful creatures after all. And the second is their hatred of demons. Devils and demons have been locked in the blood wars since time immemorial, and there is nothing that a devil hates more than a demon. Understanding these basics of Devil Society will go a long way in helping you craft a more interesting devil contract. For example, you might put a clause in your contract that says, for the duration of the contract, any souls of people that are killed are immediately bound to the devil's master. That adds an extra morality to the contract and makes your players think, well, are we okay with all of these people that die over the course of this coming battle, let's say? Are we okay with their souls being given to a grand devil or an archdevil or whatever this devil serves? I love using devil contracts because I think they add a whole heap of drama to your game. You can use them to spice up an ongoing plot thread, or they can be the basis for an entire campaign arc on their own. So what do you include in a contract with a devil? Well, let's take a look at a blank contract that I've put together, and I will walk you through some of the choices that I've made. So here is the blank version of the contract that I've created. Now this contract is broken into several parts. At its core, a contract is an agreement between 2 groups. The first party, which is going to be our devil, and the second party, which is the player characters.
Summoning fiends is risky business. They do not have your best interest at hand and will betray you at first chance. Still, there is a process to summoning them safely, and if you are successful, they can help in battle or running errands. The wizard class is what you'll want if you wish to summon fiends from the lower planes, although warlocks and clerics have some power there as well. But wizardry is the most robust of the classes when it comes to controlling and summoning fiends. There are 3 types of fiends: devils, demons, and Yugoloths. Each come from a different lower plane, the 9 hells, the abyss, and Hades respectively. Devils and demons hate one another, constantly fighting in the blood war that's been raging for what seems like forever. Any experienced spellcaster can summon one of these creatures using the spells Summon Demon or Infernal Calling, but that's too dangerous. A free-willed devil or demon running about ready to attack the conjurer isn't helpful. For example, if you summon a demon, it makes a charisma saving throw at the end of each of its turns to shake off your control. Potentially useful, but we'll want to exert more control over our summoned fiends. You'll want to bind the creature to your will, ensure it follows orders. True names can help in controlling a fiend. Everything in the multiverse has a true name, except perhaps the gods themselves. Knowing a creature's true name gives you power over it. In the case of fiends, it aids in summoning the correct one and gives disadvantage on its spell check to break free from your control. Learning true names is an arduous process. You must perform research, consulting libraries and sages all across Faerun, especially if you're searching for a particular fiend. Spells like Legend Lore can assist the wizard in this process, but it usually requires 2d12 months to discover a true name. However, if the DM wishes it, an entire campaign arc could be spent discovering the true name of a fiend. The useful thing about true names is you'll be summoning the same devil or demon each time, and not one at random. Let's start with devils. Their lawful nature makes them a bit easier to control, but don't be fooled. They will manipulate the situation towards an evil end if there is a sliver of possibility. You'll need to utilize the 5th level spell Infernal Calling, which requires a ruby worth at least 999 gold pieces. The casting takes a minute and summons a devil within range. Each of your turns after summoning the creature, you can attempt to issue verbal commands to it. The devil will comply if it's something the devil would do naturally, or a command that would bring the caster closer to evil. Otherwise, you'll need to make a charisma check contested by the devil's wisdom. You make the check with advantage if you know the devil's true name.
Dr. Thomas Radecki is a psychiatrist who teaches at the University of Illinois Medical School and who is chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence. He has been studying the game for several years and says there are 28 deaths related to Dungeons and Dragons in the last 5 years.
In some of those, it was clearly the decisive element. In other ones, it was just a major element in the thinking of the people at the time they committed suicide or murder. Is not coincidence, not when you have careful documentation, you have careful notes, you have eyewitnesses. For instance, one case, the parents saw their child summon Dungeons and Dragons demons into his room before he killed himself. Another case, the kid thought he had the ability to astral travel, coming from the Dungeons and Dragons game, that he could leave his body and come back. And he had rigged it up just according to the rule book so he could do it. He was surrounded by his materials and put a bullet in his head so he could leave his body, and he's never come back.
I have yet to see one bit of valid clinical evidence to show that this has been anything more than coincidental with a disturbed child.
If you found 12 kids in murder-suicide with one connecting factor in each of them, wouldn't you question it? And that's all people do.
I would certainly do it in a scientific manner, and this is as unscientific as you can get. It's nothing but a witch hunt.
Mirrors reflecting the broken illusion of one lost and sinful mind's eye. Protect me while caught in this dark world of fear and fading hope. My soul is warm. The sad lonely walls of innocence lost in the shades now revealed. silence, revealing cold whispers of lonely ghosts left by shadows and lightning.